Thank you so much, Mark. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to come here today. Let me just tell you, I'd like this to be a conversation. So this is really about having a discussion. And before we start, I want to define what a native is, and then I want to have this be a discussion as we talk about some of the observations I've made, okay? The topic today is surviving in Silicon Valley, 10 insider secrets the natives use. And the way I've approached this is I've taken a look at historical, cultural, and iconic things that have happened here in the Valley and looked at how they impact when you go to grow a business, okay? So before we even start in on our topic area, let's talk about what is a native, all right? We have 4 different groups, I believe, that make up what I consider a native for the purpose of this discussion and for the purpose of how it impacts growing a business. The first we have is a natural-born citizen. If you're a natural-born citizen, then both of your parents were born in the United States. They are both US citizens, okay? A natural-born citizen. The second type of native we have is we have a native-born. A native-born is when one parent is American and maybe the other parent is not, okay? Or the child becomes naturalized because of their birth here in the United States. The second thing I would consider a native is a minor child, someone who's a minor of an immigrant. And I'll talk about, does everyone know the difference between emigration and immigration? Right?
Direction.
Direction. Well, actually, no, that's migration versus emigration. So we have emigration with an E, immigration with an I, and migration with an M. Okay?
First one's out of the country, first one's in the country, migration within the country.
Well, emigration does not have a definitive amount of time you're going to spend in that place. You are emigrating, you are going to that place, but you are not necessarily going to stay there forever. You are transferred or you are relocated, but you may not be there forever. It is a step on your journey, but it doesn't come with the kind of the permanent idea. Immigration with an I actually has the idea of permanency. It's the idea that you want to make that your home and you want to stay there for extended period. Migration is that movement, but it doesn't have the ownership piece of the first two. Okay? So for the purpose of my discussion, natives for me are natural born, which would be 2 parents, native born, 1 parent, child born here, minor, immigrant, or if you happen to be an adult when you move to this country and you have been here since prior to 1985, 80 to 85, I would still consider you a native. And there's a reason I picked that time frame, 85. Okay? Now, if you came in 1990 and you're still here, some of the things that I'm going to talk about harken back 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes 70 years before that. And so I kind of defined it this way so that we were as close to the time frames of where I'm making reference to. Okay? Any questions? All right, so let's get to know who's here in the room, first of all. Can I see by a show of hands how many people are natural natives? Both parents were born and raised here. 14. Okay. Oops, not there. 14. How many people are natives? 1 parent was at least born here, or you were born here and you have citizenship. 4. 5. Wait, can you put your hands up again? Just ballpark. I'm going to tell you if this actually reflects what we have in the Valley. That's why. Okay? The next one is if you were a minor, you were brought here by your parents as a child, you were born in a different country, but you came here before, I'd say, the age of 16, 17. 2, okay? And anyone who actually was born somewhere else could be a different citizen, but actually has been here since the 1980s. Wow, look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. It's a very interesting thing when we take a look at that. Here's a question. How many of you are startup owners or have their own businesses? Okay. How many of you have heard people say, I don't know anyone who was born in the Valley? Has anyone heard that before? Am I the only person who, wait, hold on. Am I the only person who's heard that before? I've heard that before. Has anyone heard of someone else say, oh, there's no natives here? Okay, so look at this. Right here, right here, right here, and right here. Anybody not fit into this in this room? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 here. So what?
You can be born in the U.S. but not in this valley, right?
True. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So what I hear all the time is that there are no natives, and I always argue back. But there are. There are lots of us. We just define ourselves differently. So the focus of my conversation today is to take you through different parts of the business, and we're going to talk about a lot of different parts of the business and kind of look at it through a combination of 3 optics. Historical optic, looking for cycles, things that have happened in time. Look at it through a cultural optic. What are some of the cultural impacts that have happened in this valley that have impacted the way we do things? Looking at iconic things that have happened that have marked us during that time. Okay, so we're going to talk about, I'm going to run through the 10 things we're going to talk about. There's only 8 of them on the board, but I go into a lot of detail in some of them. We're going to look at the calculated market, the choice for market space that a business owner makes when they move to this valley, and what has been very successful in the past. So how many people here have a business with a service component? Please raise your hands. Okay, it looks like about 2/3. How many people have a business that has no service component at all? Nobody, 1 person raised their hand. Okay, so in my professional experience, one of the things I want to tell you is I'm going to toss out some statistics today because I actually survey my client base. You can ask Mark. I often go out to my client base and ask them to fill out surveys so that I have an idea of what they're living and what they're going through. So I've found that of the 60 companies I've worked with, 100% have had some sort of service component to them. So that kind of reflects what this room is. We're all but 1. Okay, all but 1 have that. The second thing we're going to look at once we look at the market, we're going to look at the power plays. How do you work on your network, right? Then we're going to look at insider info. Where does the information in this valley reside? Then we're going to look at calculated career moves. As a business owner, there are some calculated career moves you need to keep in mind, looking at cultural things that have happened in the past and pendulum swings we've had in the valley. Then we're going to take a look at corporate culture. What are things you want to include in your corporate culture, in your business, so that you will survive and attract the people that will allow you to survive? Then after that, we're going to talk about tenacious talent. We're going to take a look at some of my maxims for when you go to hire. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, and we'll go back and take a look at how those pan out. We're going to look at growth and how it's done in this valley, because everyone spends time talking about growth, but there's lots of different ways to grow. And we're going to talk about what it was in the past, what it is now, and a little bit about where I kind of see it going in the future. And then the last thing is a little bit softer. We're going to talk about what I call sanctimonious synergy. Sanctimonious synergy. And we're going to hit that at the very end. And I think that's going to just kind of wrap everything all up. All right, so let's get going and start talking about this. Okay, so calculated market. We're going to talk about the sectors that win, okay? The sectors that win in this market. Can anyone tell me when the first boom, the first really major boom was in California?
49?
Huh?
1849.
Exactly, gold rush. Absolutely, it was the gold rush. So culturally, that has influenced how we grow in this state, okay? In California, you would think that if we look at sectors, primary, secondary, and tertiary, does everyone know what I'm referring to? Primary meaning anything that is agriculture, mining, fishing, anything that's taken from the land. Those are all primary sectors, right? First boom, we just said, is actually primary sector. Secondary market is anything that is manufacturing, process-oriented, or actually construction, okay? In this valley, we had to construct everything out here because they came over in covered wagons, so that's a huge piece of this valley. And the third area is tertiary, service-oriented, which can't happen unless those first 2. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as what I have found with client base is the number 1 sector that people open businesses in if they're natives?
Service.
Absolutely. In this valley, it is a tertiary valley. And I would even go out to say that every business who is here, who is linked to high tech, who is linked to biotech, is actually in the tertiary business. And let me tell you the 3 reasons why. The first reason is because, actually, let's take a step back. Let's look really quickly at, before I tell you why I think they're all tertiary, let's take a look at just one area. Let's look at electronic components and the evolution of electronic components. It started with vacuum tubes. Does everyone remember vacuum tubes?
Yep.
If you're too young, please don't let me know because I'll feel old.
Lady Forest, Palo Alto, California.
Absolutely, vacuum tubes. The second piece we had was test equipment. Everyone remember, Bill? Test equipment.
HP.
Huh? HP, absolutely. Next wave we had was microwaves. Defense. Varian. Yeah, and even before that, the whole NASA, everything that we did with the shuttles, Apollo, Pioneer. Then we have semiconductors. Then we have integrated circuits. Okay. So if we look at just one area, this is what I would call electronic components, right? And we look at the valley, one might argue that those are really kind of manufacturing pieces. And I would argue, actually, they really fit in tertiary because vacuum tubes went in almost everything, from television sets to large VAX computers to anything at the time would take a vacuum tube to get it to run, correct? Now, you're in IP. You remember vacuum tubes,
Absolutely.
right? So vacuum tubes, give me an example of a couple of industries where vacuum tubes were implemented other than television.
Computers.
Computers. What else?
All the computers.
Yep, all the computers, all the test equipment was using vacuum tubes initially before it took off as its own. Microwaves were used as it moved into the semiconductor industry, as it moved down to there. So there's three things that I think are important about it being a tertiary market. The first is that generally we're all B2B, okay? So how many people in this room sell B2B? Okay, very interesting. One of the interesting things is the title of my talk is Surviving in Silicon Valley. If you're going to survive, you need to be able to serve the largest sector possible. And this valley mutates, moves, and changes. And what I find is that natives start businesses that serve other businesses, and they're completely agnostic to what that business does, or they're able to mutate as business changes. Okay? So the first thing I would say in this valley is we would say that they're B2B. The application cuts across multiple industries, and they're extremely high volume. That is something that absolutely marks this valley. Any business that starts here that survives focuses on high volume, even if it's a service-based company with no component. If it's a component company, it does that as well. Okay? So that's the first area. I think that when we look at this valley and we look at surviving, the question is, what sector are you in? And the calculated market is your tertiary, your B2B, your high volume, and you have multiple types of components, and you can move with the market. Okay? Let's look at one other thing. There's three kinds of businesses that actually succeed, right? Everyone comes here to Silicon Valley because this is kind of the place, like, I'm gonna hit it rich, I'm gonna get gold, right? So you have three ways businesses succeed. One, it's a new business that never existed before. Can someone give me a business that never existed before?
Google.
Google searched it. That's a good one, but it didn't completely change the paradigm. The concept of Google is, I'm going to provide you with a directory. We've had that since Dewey Decimal System. We've got a directory of how we organize our information. So I would tell you that yes, it was new in the way they solved the problem, but it was not groundbreakingly different. Do you see how that's different? Now, somebody give me an example of any company that completely changed the paradigm of how we live.
Xerox Park.
I'm sorry, what? Someone? One?
Xerox Park.
Well, Xerox Park, absolutely. The mouse.
Mouse. That's our
The mouse, that concept didn't even exist before. I can give you another one. PayPal.
Yeah.
The whole idea that you could transfer money through something that people weren't even using the day they set up the business. People were not at a high rate of usage for email, and having an email address enable the movement of cash. That concept, that model did not exist, right? Somebody else said Facebook, I heard. Obviously. right? So there's a couple of different ways you can be successful in this valley. You can come up with this, blow up the entire model and have an entirely new model. But when we think about all the companies, run through your head right now of all the companies in this valley. We've named 3. How many actually are completely breaking the model? Not that many. Now, how many are changing the way we solved the problem before? Google did that. They changed the way we access information. Intuit did it. They changed the way we file our information for accounting, right? We already had to do accounting, but now we do it electronically. NetApp does the same thing, right? Someone else give me an example of something where we changed. The cloud. We still had files before. Now we just changed the model. So the second way you become a successful company is you change the model slightly. It's not about completely shifting it. Now, how many people think that that's where the preponderance of the businesses are? There's more there?
I think the biggest thing is with social media, we've empowered the customer to go after the business. The customer's now driving the market, whereas the market was driven by the companies. We've empowered the customer.
So the question is with social media, what I'm talking about is the model that makes you explode. So I totally agree with you, totally agree. But I'm thinking you have the paradigm of you completely explode the model. You have the paradigm of I change the way things are done. And then the last paradigm, which is I think where a lot of us fit in, is I support all those businesses that do A and B and anything else. That's the third model, right? I support all the businesses. If you do A, if you are going to like completely change the world, then I support you, PayPal. If you're eBay, and we already had auctions before, but you're going to change the way paradigms are done, I support you too. Or let's say you're ASL. I support you as well.
How about business consulting? Making
Business
companies
consulting.
Much better than they are now, which
There you
all
go.
companies need help.
All companies need. So here's a question. In this valley, which one is the one where most of the natives go? Where do they go?
No.
Isn't it a no-brainer? Now, in this room, how many people who raised their hand who said that they are a native? And I mean the first, let's do anyone on this top half of the list. How many people fit the third paradigm? Raise your hand. Raise them up higher. Okay. How many people hit the second paradigm? So all of you are going to change the way that what you're doing never existed before. It's a completely new model. What you're doing
1.5.
1.5. Okay. Okay. So I would argue that there's 3 different markets and that the natives, the people who live here, oftentimes will support either in 2 or 3. That's where I find most of my clients. So I ran statistical analysis on my clients. I have 60 plus companies I ran it on, and I found that almost all of my clients fit in the last 2 categories. But the interesting thing is if you ask how long have your clients been around, and on average, if you combine them, so this includes my startups in conjunction with my older companies, because I can separate them into 2 buckets. On average, 21 years. You separate them into 2 buckets. There's one of them that's up around 30 and one that's down around 5, right? Depending on what the business model is that they're doing and if they're a startup or not, okay? So that's another thing I wanted to mention. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what the paradigm is. We've talked a little bit about how you make money in this valley. We've talked a little bit about that. Let's keep moving. Power plays. All right, so I want some more participation. All right, how do you build your network? Who's new here to the valley? Anyone new? Okay. If you want to answer, feel free. Anyone else want to jump in, feel free. You want to build your network. I actually asked this question to Mark about a week and a half ago. You want to build your network. You want to build your professional network. How do you do it? LinkedIn. Join organizations. Go to events.
Alumni associations of your school.
Alumni associations. Okay, so now this is where go ahead. Networkers. Okay, so this is where I'm going to get into the historical culture of this valley. Okay? Who can tell me kind of the 4 to 5 primary ethnic groups that were in this valley in 1930?
Croatian.
Huh? Italian. Italian, yes. Portuguese, absolutely.
Croatian.
Spanish and Irish. Croatian, I think there weren't as many as the first three groups, but yes, there was an Eastern European contingency. Italian, Portuguese, Irish.
Whatever the Chinese.
Huh? So there weren't as many Chinese here, there were Japanese. The Japanese in the 30s, they were very numerous, but they were more in the South Bay, not as much in San Francisco. Chinese in San Francisco, Japanese in South Bay, right? So, but what I think is interesting is even if we let's put down the Japanese, because we're in San Jose, so I'm being very specific about locality. So Japan. Okay, now let's look for commonality. What do some of these cultures have in common? The SP means also Mexican. It's Spanish and Mexican because we just finished the war, right? So what is a cultural thing that all these people have in common? They're all Latin-based.
They're willing to leave their home country for a better life.
They are.
Risk-takers.
They are risk takers. They are inherent risk takers. So we have a risk-taking culture of a group of people who actually share a cultural norm, and it's a faith-based norm. They're Catholic. They're faith-based. Now, does that ignore anything else? No, but it does make it very strong.
Primary industries.
Huh?
Primary industries. Agriculture.
Agriculture. Okay.
Agricultural background.
Agricultural backgrounds.
That's not why they sailed the seas.
No. Well, I think people came for different reasons, and I think that's what Pamela was making a reference to. So she made reference to the Eastern Europeans who were here as well. We had a large contingency, but there was a huge, so what I was trying to get to is that there is a huge cultural impact of Christianity, and more specifically in this valley, that can't be ignored, Catholicism. So can anyone take a hazardous guess in the state of California, guess just how many Catholic schools there are?
How many what?
Catholic schools? I looked this up last night.
2,000.
Wow, you're
High school,
grade schools?
grade school, high
709. Okay? High schools, over 350. Okay, so it's a very interesting concept. These people come with this cultural background that brings them here. Okay? So if I am going to go out and try and meet people, I have to keep in mind that component.
Absolutely.
So if I'm a native and I am of one of these ethnic groups, what might be one of my number one ways to meet people and to connect my power in the community?
Sure.
How come we didn't hear that though when we just spoke, did we?
No, we didn't.
Interesting.
Well,
Secondary thing.
Is it as powerful now as it was then? No.
I would argue, I think it is. So
Maybe.
here's a question. Mark, what did I ask you a week and a half ago?
She asked me where my greatest number of contacts would be.
Mm-hmm.
So, I thought, well, it's probably through church. Where do I spend my time in the weekends, or who am I meeting outside business?
Absolutely.
Probably.
Absolutely. So there's a second cultural norm that this valley has that is unusual, and that is education. And people don't know this, but we have university institutions. Now, we're not the East Coast. We didn't start in 1608 like Dartmouth College, okay? But then again, we're not in New Hampshire, and we have nice winters, so. But if we look at the education system out here in California, we had, in 1850, we had University of the Pacific, has been around since 1850. 1851, Santa Clara University. The Men's Evening Normal School, which you all are like, the what? The Men's Evening Normal School was a women's 3-year college that in 1880 graduated a class of 70 women who had a 3-year degree. In 1880. Okay. That's before women's suffrage, just to be clear. Okay, we had San Jose Teachers College. We had, so the other thing I would argue is that alumni associations and education, and an example is I'm a 4th generation native from the Valley. My grandmother not only had a bachelor's, but had a master's degree.
Very unusual.
Very unusual, but plausible in an environment where Cal existed, Stanford's around, you've got Santa Clara, you've got UOP used to be in San Jose, the men's college was in San Jose, the men's normal middle college, men's evening normal school.
What is that now?
It folded into San Jose State University. Okay? But an interesting concept is if you're going to have a network and you're a native, you kind of know that it's going to be education-based too, because that's part of what your family did here in the area. So it's kind of another thing to keep in mind. We all mentioned social media. So did anyone mention Meetup? Anyone mention Meetup? No? But some people mentioned networking events. Okay, so when you're trying to build your power play, when you're trying to build your power network, part of what you're doing is you're building for who you are in the past moving forward. You're not building from where you are today moving forward. And that's why I go back to the cultural norms, because those are who you are at ground level. It's not today and moving forward. Meetup is today and moving forward, right? LinkedIn is interesting. It's an online platform that allows me to be who I was and be firmly in that, depending on how I use it. Also depends on who you connect to. I don't connect to anyone who I can't tell you what I do for a living and can't describe what I do for a living. Because to me, that's important. So anyway, now we've talked about power plays. Let's talk about insider info, okay? Any questions? Anyone, any comments? Okay, let's move on a little bit. Well, actually, let me add two more things to where you find your power base. Philanthropy. How many people are involved in philanthropy in this room? Raise your hand. Okay, so philanthropy is a really big part of this valley. And if you look at the men's and women's organizations that have been around forever, there are a lot of social groups that are private social groups in this valley that people don't talk about, they don't make the news, but that have a philanthropic thrust. A good example would be Children's Hospital at Stanford. The Women's Auxiliary for that has existed for, I think, close to 75 years. I think they already had their 75-year anniversary. It's a very big philanthropic push, but it's also an organization where you can meet people of common like mind. There are a lot of professional social organizations too, not just down here in the South Bay, but I'm sure many of you know about Pacific Union, about Bohemian, about St. Clair, about Town Club, about some of these private organizations that we don't talk about a lot, but that are very strong and have a huge philanthropic component to them. Okay, the next thing, let's move on. Let's talk about insider info. Okay, so now we're talking about growing a business, right? So we need to know where the insider info is here in the valley, right? Where is it? So let's back up. Can somebody tell me what, where do you think insider info resides in this valley?
Technology, solving technological problems.
Technology, yeah, but I'm talking about the intellectual knowledge. So I agree that technology solves problems, but if I'm looking for insider info, I would go with the banking industry.
Venture capital folks know too.
I'm not going to hit venture capital right away. I want to spend a minute on banking and why banking.
Okay.
So can anyone tell me banks that were founded in California in this valley? Wells Fargo, Fremont Bank, Bank of America, Bank of the West.
Not this valley though. Bank of America was founded in San Francisco.
It was in San Francisco.
Greater.
Close.
Greater Valley.
Greater Valley. We also have Crocker Bank,
Yeah.
Transamerica Financial, First Interstate Bank, Giannini family, American Express. So American Express was actually part of Wells and Fargo started an express service. Anyone remember Butterfield and Butterfield auctioneers? Yeah, well, Butterfield joined with Wells and Fargo to form American Express. So where is the power source of information in this valley?
Where the money is.
Where the money is. There is a secondary, and I'm going to take you on the technology piece because we are very intellectual in this valley. We started with banking, financial. Everyone here, does everyone kind of feel an affinity to numbers in this room? Kind of like to measure stuff?
Yes.
Yeah? Yes? Anyone else? Numbers, kind of? Okay. So we also like technical. Anyone attached to the technical aspect? Anyone raise their hand? Okay, there's another place that I think is really strong in this valley. And it doesn't mean that they're all based out here, but the usage of their information is out here. Industry analyst firms. Industry analysts. So you have two kinds of industry analysts. You have financial industry analysts, which obviously dovetail in with the last part of our conversation. And the second kind of industry analyst are the technology industry analysts. And there's a lot of them in this valley, and there are a lot of people who leverage their information and insider knowledge here in this valley. Okay? let's see, industry analysts. Okay, and then I'm going to put something out that I think is actually kind of in the future. And it's just a concept, and it has to do with the venture capital piece. So I'm going to go out on a limb here. You don't have to agree with me. But I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that I think that another clearinghouse for inside information. So once again, we're talking about insider info. That's where we are right now, insider info. I believe that insider info in this valley, and a good holder of that, and this is a really interesting spin, crowdfunding platforms that are white label solutions, meaning I have a technology that is a crowdfunding platform. Why are these guys the center of information? I'll tell you why. They fund companies. They have brokers who have financial information. They have investors that they house all the investor information for qualified SEC investors. They have technology companies that are coming up with new ideas that need funding from these guys and have to pass through them. And they have all of their financial information. They are a powerhouse. I can't think of another industry that brings that many pieces of the puzzle together.
You make an incredible good point. How are you extracting that data? Because the only people that are using that data right now are companies that are creating data stacks in order to advertise.
So remember, our discussion was, where does the insider info sit?
Right.
So with each business model, so the reason I said a white label solution and I didn't give you a single site is because the guys who do white label solutions have the data from all the different business models that are being formed around all those different business models that are loading on top.
Right.
So my discussion today is, where do you find insider info? Get to know those guys. That's what I would say. Get to know them. I think it's an interesting concept. Now, is this because you want to access the data? I'm talking about surviving in Silicon Valley. I'm not talking about ripping off Silicon Valley and then leaving. Okay?
New York,
It's
right?
a very different, and I think that that's an interesting point, because when you're talking about data and you're talking about this kind of data, the information and insider info and insider flow. Now, and I'm not talking about divulging things that the SEC doesn't want you to know. Okay? Let me be clear. I'm not talking about crossing any. It's a black and white line. We don't go close to it. Okay? But I'm talking about, where does insider info sit? That's a very good place. Okay? Does everyone see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. That's insider information. And then we've got a couple of, the legacy families in the Valley. Can anyone give me a name of a legacy family in the Valley? Sobrato, yes. Draper, yes. Who else? Swenson, yes. Huh? Ritchie, yes, right? So you've got all the different families who've been here multi-generations. Okay. Can anyone tell me, if they wanted to talk, if thought leaders, give me a person who is considered a thought leader in this valley, because that gets down to information as well. A thought leader. I can think of one.
McKenna.
John Doerr.
Regis McKenna, John Doerr,
Nolan Bushnell.
Bushnell, Sonsini, Mary Meeker. Mary Meeker, very much so. Okay, so that's another place to go to get the information. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your calculated career. All right, so this is where I'm going to draw a little bit of a parallel to what the Valley has done, okay, and what we've seen in the Valley. So, 1970s. 1970s, the CEO of most companies at that time had sales on their resume. If you had sales on your resume, in ballpark, and I'm being generalized, okay, this is a general. In the 70s, you had sales, right? In the 80s, it was marketing. If you had marketing on your resume, you might end up in the C-suite. Does everyone agree with me on this? Sales, it was all about getting sales. Marketing, all in the 80s, it was all about marketing. Let's talk about the 90s. So I'm going to put 90s here. Is financial marketing. Because at that point, we started looking at a lot of business transactions, right? People were IPOing. We were starting down that whole trend. So the whole financial marketing, I'm not going to call it finance because it wasn't pure finance, because we were just discovering that part of the industry as far as the number of transactions increasing and seeing some really large numbers, okay? So then we saw a little bit more towards financial marketing, which kind of eventually gave towards more of the finance guy. ended up in this. So what we're looking at is who ends up in the C-suite, right? These are who ends up in the C-suite. Following that, we saw a real big shift after finance to R&D. And we ended up with, in the C-suite, a bunch of R&D people. And then we realized, oh, that's not working really well. No offense if you're in R&D, but the general Valley trend shied away from it in less than a 10-year span and really a 5-year span, and it moved over to product marketing. Does anyone disagree, or do you all see what I'm talking about? These are the people who were getting put into C-level positions as heads of companies for some of the larger major corporations. I'm not talking about the small B2B people. Okay? And then the very last thing is we started seeing some of the investment people. And this is the investment people entering into C-suite, right? So people came through the venture capital firms.
So going from R&D to product marketing, you're shortening your horizon.
Yes.
You're not inventing transistors in product marketing, but you are in R&D.
Exactly.
That overlaps.
Which is why we all of a sudden had to change to an investment strategy, because we had to acquire more technology in order for our companies to be more successful. So it makes absolute sense that we went from R&D to product marketing, long-term, shorter term, oh no, fill out the product set. And as Mark mentioned, I believe that the next round that we go, and where we're going, is we will have a C-suite. We will have a CEO, but he will probably have a large amount of products side to him, and he will need to have a shadow, and that shadow is a CSO, because there's just too much data, too much information, and too much work required right now for one CEO to have a finger and pulse on everything going on in the business. Okay? So one of the things I wanted to talk about is, where does this go from here? This is kind of where we are, and I see this for the next few years. But I wanted to hazard a guess as to, once we finish this phase, investment, move to CEO, CSO, what's the next phase after that? Anyone want to take a guess of where they think, who's going to end up in the C-suite?
So like you said, I think your thought leaders are going to be the people who are going to inspire more of all of that put together. They're going to inspire more R&D. They're going to inspire more ability to market, ability to advertise. It's the inspiration. It's going to be more of a feeling kind of person.
Interesting.
A feeling person.
Somebody that can make the best use out of this horrendous amount of data we're gathering.
That's what I wanted.
And that's what
Data. I agree with you, they're going to have charisma, but I think data is going to have two phases.
That's what
Phase
the head
one,
of,
phase one is going to be
said last night.
lighter data, and phase two is going to be heavy lifting analytical. But I think that the next phase going into the C-suite, this will, I think, continue for another 5 years. But then, and not because they don't have it, but because there's two, they can divide and conquer the data right now. But they're going to eventually have to have a data hat. And the CEO will then be the data person. So yes?
You know, I get this feeling looking at this that I'm a little confused.
Okay.
Because you look at the earlier days of Hewlett Packard, I would associate with those guys being hardcore engineers. You look at Grove at Intel, drove this valley like crazy, well beyond it, and he was an engineer's engineer.
Absolutely.
And you look at the current crop of the past current crop, like Steve Jobs, who didn't really fit any of those things.
Well, I think he kind of fit more of the marketer piece and the product marketing, to be honest. I think he started on a marketing and he kind of finished more in
But
here.
it doesn't fit any of them perfectly,
Okay.
for sure. And you look at the Googles and many others around here, you know, they're many of them are not in the classic mode because they've been alive long enough, some of them, to actually figure out what they really are good at.
Well, I think what I'm saying is that there's been a trend in this valley for how hiring's happened and how we perceive growth. And that trend has moved and changed through time. And that in the 70s, we were focused very much on the sales. Then we moved over and we were focused on the marketing. Then we moved over and we were focused on the financial issue. Then we moved over and we said, okay, now we need to look at R&D. Now we need to look at product marketing. Now we're going to move over. Maybe the investment guys can help us a little bit because we need to do some transactions. And I say it's moving right now towards strategy and more into the data stack. It's just a trend, and it can be in the C-suite. It doesn't have to be only the CEO, but I think it's a skill set. And what I'm trying to get to is, if we want to survive in this valley, we have to be able to project these kind of fluctuations. And so I see this as an interesting fluctuation and something that merits to be thought about, because how am I going to keep my career?
But so how did the R&D part become the liability? Because we just nominated a whole group of people who radically changed the world as being all R&D.
Okay, so let me back up. I love this valley and I love the R&D piece. I'm just trying to talk about, and one of the things I'm thinking about is if we're going to survive in the valley, there are going to be fluctuations and changes in what people expect and what they want to see in leadership positions.
Well, what about surviving in the world? Forget the valley. You know what? Because you look at the Japanese who've had terrible times, but they've had eras of great engineers running companies, and it's gone sour, I recognize, but the Germans have a lot of that, and they're still doing.
I don't think there's anything wrong, and I'm not, just because I'm talking about skill sets doesn't mean that somebody with an engineering skill set cannot fulfill the roles in the other roles. I'm just making an observation, so I'm not trying to offend anyone, and I apologize if you took it as such.
It's whether we are offending our own intelligence by concentrating on short-term issues of popular change when there's actually maybe a more fundamental issue that in the United States, we don't necessarily understand how to master the technologies that we need to survive.
Okay.
Bigger issue,
And I,
problem in a different discussion. This is
Yeah.
just a trend, and she's absolutely right. We put leaders in those specific roles at those specific times, and now it's data, and that's absolutely correct. We're all going after data now, and if you look at any CEO of any company, they're after data and data stacking, and they're creating these huge models, and they have all these people coming over. So you're right.
yeah, and I think, and so I think that we can't solve the world problem right now of issues with the U.S. government and our ability to educate our next generation. I do think we have a problem with it. There's a good thing that there are a lot of people spending time in this valley thinking of different ways and solutions that I think will actually come to fruition and help us move past that. But for right now, I think we need to move on, okay, and keep talking a little bit about some of the other things. So,
Can I ask you one quick question?
absolutely.
So much of what companies are doing now is team building. You know, they're trying to find the right people, and they're trying to keep their team together. And we've seen a lot of migration of Google people to Facebook and all this different stuff. So, isn't that a primary skill set that we would like to see in CEOs?
Oh,
to keep the team together?
absolutely. I think that, and I think that's also why when we see the split CEO, CSO, what you're doing is you're getting someone who's extremely strong on the people skills and someone who's stronger on some of the analytical skills, and they're able to conquer together as a team. And I think it makes a really interesting comment on how we're changing the way we manage and we grow these businesses that are really organic and that will grow for more decades into the future. And so I kind of like the idea that there's this model now. With the data, is it going to take a two-person role? It may. I'm just not at a place right now where I can see that yet. I just see that it needs two personality types now in order to be able to deal with what is required on a legal disclosure basis and on a growth basis for the product sets. Okay? Let's move on really quick. Let's talk about calculated career moves. We already talked about this, corporate culture. Let's move on and talk about keeping your talent, okay? So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about talent, all right? I have 3 rules that I've noticed in this valley that are kind of interesting. At least I think they're interesting. First thing, can anyone tell me what these dates apply to? Hold on, where'd the dates go? Let me turn this around. 1 second. What do those dates refer to? Anyone?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
The dates that are on the thing, 1975 to 77, 85 to 87. Recessions, okay. They're recessions. What's the one truth in this valley?
We'll have another one.
We'll have another one. What's the other truth that we all know is happening? We'll get over it. And the other thing is it's getting shorter. It's getting shorter. Okay, so we know that this is happening. So let's talk about hiring people. How many people, when they look at a resume, go through and eyeball those dates to see the title of the person had during that time frame?
That's only if you have a chrono resume in front of you.
Well, in general. How many people look, so how many people may not look at those dates, but look at 08 to 2010? They get a resume in front of them, and mentally, you may not like consciously do it, but your eyes roll down to 08, 2010, what were they doing? Isn't that interesting?
Maybe nothing.
They were maybe nothing. Well, there's a couple of things that happen. The first thing that happened is we have the rule of ever-inflating titles. I call it the tenet of thermal titles. Thermal titles grow when we are in bull and contract when we're in bear, right? They boom, they bust, they boom, they bust. It comes, it goes, it comes, it goes. So if I get a resume in front of me, I take a look really quickly, 2008, or 2009, 2010, 02, 04, what was their title? Because if they could do it during a downturn, they're good at what they do. If they didn't do it during a downturn, you can see what their skill set is that they bring to a table when the market's tight and they need to wear more than one hat. Okay? So one of the things I would say was when you're looking to grow your company and you're looking to hire, always look at these dates because it tells you a lot about the person. And realize that there's the tenet of thermal titles. Okay? Second thing, rule of multiplicity. How many people in this valley how many in this room have had an IPO? Raise your hand. Awesome. 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. How many people in this room have done it twice? Okay. So one of the things in this valley is to do things once is challenging. So I think we need to applaud all of those people who actually have done what we all dream about. But we also have to realize that to do it twice is really hard. So when we look at those resumes and they come across our desk, the question is, what is the multiplicity of experience this person has had? How many times have they done things? How many things have they seen? Because I don't want someone who's going to ask me how to do it. I want them to come to me and say, here's the problem, here's 2 solutions. I think this one's the best one because I've done it twice before. Great, moving on. That's what I want as the head of a company, right? You're going to run into that all the time. So the rule of multiplicity is king. That they actually have multiple experience. I'm not interested in someone who has only done social media marketing for 15 years. Now, that's a great skill set, but if I have them making decisions, they're going to run into things that they may not have seen before. But if they've done the marketing side and they've done the other side of marketing, traditional marketing, and they've done the social media side, and they run into a problem, they have a different skill set to look at the problem through. It's a different pair of glasses. It's another way to look at things, and I find that personally very valuable. It doesn't mean that the person who only did 15 years in one thing is wrong. It's just a different way of looking at hiring. The other thing is, I know that this valley is going to contract. When it contracts, that person who was doing social marketing might have to put on the traditional marketing hat. So I sure as heck want to make sure that they have multiplicity of experience so that I can go ahead and leverage them when I have to tighten my belt. Okay? So here's another thing to keep in mind. When we talk about hiring, does anyone have an idea how many people leave this valley when we go through one of those contractions? Huh? Hundreds of thousands. We will lose between 250,000 and 500,000 people projected in the next downturn.
Are they the people that we want to leave?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Which brings us to why we have to pay attention to who we hire. Because those are the people you want to have with you when you lose 250,000 people, right? So between 250,000 and 400,000 are going to leave during the next one. It's not going to be 500,000, it's going to be about that. That would put us down at about 12% unemployment, which this last one we got up to 13.9, almost 14%. So that would be a downturn, but not as deep as the last one, depending on what happens financially with Wall Street, and if we have a complete implosion, it could go higher. So it could be as many as 500,000. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so we've talked now about all of those different areas of keeping people, how to grow your business, and what you need to keep in mind in order to be competitive moving forward. Let's talk about growth and how it's done. Okay? Let's talk about growth and how it's done. I only have 2 more things to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay. All right. So you need to grow a company. How do you grow it? What's the first place you try and bring in new revenue from? Anyone? Current customers. So sales. Sales. Top line. Everyone with me? Top line. Does everyone agree that when you're going to grow a company, you need to increase top line? True. Is that it? That's how you grow a company? Acquisition. So we have basically top line, and I'm going to call the next one transactions. Okay? Sorry, that's how we do it in France. So top line revenue, that's one way to grow. Transactions. Next, how do you grow? You're head of a company, you need to squeeze your margins. What do you do next? Silos, by looking at every functional area. It is a bottom line revenue issue, but we're actually looking functionally. So we look into each function. Okay? We look into each function and we see, can we squeeze down anything there? What's the fourth way we can improve profitability in a company? We're looking down silos right now. Cross silo, cross functionally, things that cross between different areas. We're not just looking down, we're looking across. Okay? So I would call that cross functional.
Where's the part about making the pie bigger through additional product development?
So additional, that would be transaction. So transaction to me is M&A, so merger, acquisition, spin-off, spin-out, new product set, right? It can be acquiring a book of business. So the interesting thing with transaction is it hits top and bottom line. You can be doing it because you're buying a book of business. Did it with a client who's the manufacturing over off De La Cruz. We did it because we really wanted to increase top line because we bought their book of business. Did it 2 months later with the same company with someone else because we were actually trying to offset some of our functional costs on operations, their manufacturing firm. Right? Different way of looking at it. So to increase and grow a company, you have top line, transaction, functional. You're looking at the silo, right? So silo. And cross-functional. The last place that you look when you're trying to grow is advisory board, your board of directors, right? Bringing in expertise, higher level, things that you may not have thought of. Now, you may ask, where's cash come in? VC, angel, all that. That's transaction. That's really transaction because the cash can be used for this or for that, right? So that's another way that we grow. Go ahead.
Well, so you've got a Yahoo with all this Alibaba money, and they're going to go after new transactions.
Absolutely.
You've got, I don't know, 20 billion to spend over it.
I'm free next weekend.
That'd be a
Okay, so that's another way we grow. Okay. Outsource is a way to grow, but that would be functional because when you outsource, you don't outsource cross-functionally generally. You outsource within a single area because you can get a financial gain in that area or for that ratio. Now, you could argue there are some cross-functional outsourcing, and I would agree that there are, but there is not that much. Generally, you're in a silo. Okay? All right, so we've talked a little bit about all the different ways we grow. We want to survive in the valley, and we want to be aware that growth is 5 things. It's not one. It's not just top line, and it's not just cutting costs. It's all of those. But if we really want to survive in this valley, and this is kind of really, California has a reputation about being granola and hippie-esque and,
That's Haight-Ashbury.
we're all out there, yeah. Sanctimonious synergy, right? We're all about energy.
But yet, upstate New York is trying to steal our companies. There are ads
That's
on
true.
TV every day.
That's true. That's true.
So we must not be all bad.
Yeah. So sanctimonious synergy is not about, sanctimonious synergy is really about not being distracted by fads. This valley goes through fads like that. This is popular, that's popular, so-and-so's here, so-and-so's gone. I can think of a couple of angel investors and VCs that I won't expect to see here after the next downturn, right? There's a lot of fads that come and go, but there's a lot of things that stay the same. And there's 2 things to survive in this valley you have to do. One is you have to be present. Meaning, you have to be present and completely present with yourself for anything that happens. Synergy does not happen if you force it. It doesn't. It never does. It never has. So it's not about planning. It's not about control. But it's about being completely present in the moment and letting those things happen. That's one rule that will make you successful because people will drop into your vision, your line of view, the people you meet at networking events, the people in this room. I know that there's some things happening right now because I'm present that I will have opportunity through those people to do interesting, fun, amazing things. But you have to be present, right? And the second thing is relationships. And almost everything I talked about here had to do with flows and historical of how history has been, how trends have been. But trends and history are only about relationships and how relationships grow and change. And so the final thing I think that in order to be successful in this valley, you need to cultivate those relationships. You need to be true to them. And you need to look at the ones and put in through time. Because the people who have been here for decades and the people who will be here in decades are the ones who do that. It's not how many people can I connect to on LinkedIn. It's how many people can I connect to someone else I know. And it's coming from a very different place. And it's not a, I've been to networking events. Hey, how you doing? Oh yeah, well I think I can connect with someone. Oh here, let me get your card and I'll give you someone else's card. No. It's about growing those relationships and seeing people over and over again and making sure that that works. So those are 10 of the different things I think that you should keep in mind, or maybe more, probably closer to 15. I have a bunch more, but I think we're out of time. If anyone has questions, I'm available, but I want to thank you for coming out today.
All right, that was great. This was a different kind of a seminar, but I think just watching everybody, I think everybody was very interested in what you had to say. So we appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
So she'll take some time.
I'll take some questions.
15 minutes
Sir.
or so. And
So when's the next downturn?
Ah. Well, what do you know, I think that's really interesting. What do you guys think?
As soon as we change the president.
You think as soon as we change the president? Well, yeah. So historically, we keep the economy going, regardless of which party is in office, until after the presidential election. And we always have a downturn. Even if it's a slower, slight blip, always, generally. I looked it up going into the last election, and I think it was like 15 presidents back, we could see some economic impact immediately following, because they prop it up very heavily in the fall going into November. And then come January, things kind of start to peter a little bit. So I think we'll see a little bit of movement then, but when is the big downturn? I don't know, but I think it's coming.
Worldwide?
Yes. Yeah. We've been printing too much money.
Okay, the reason I said that is that just this week in China, we have to knock down our carbon usage, and they can go on for till 2030, which means and a developed country is based on electrical energy, period. And so they're going to drive us down, and they can just go along, and that's not going to be good for us.
No. I think there's a lot of forces. So I lived abroad, just for all of you who don't know, I lived overseas from 1988 to about 2002. I lived in 9 different countries, and I opened offices for businesses in 26. And so I like being international, and some of the comments and things that I made may have sounded like I'm very much here, but they're things that I also took from the idea that I actually was always, I'm usually the only one in the room, the one who's not from that place in the room when I'm out doing business. So some of my comments and stuff have to do with, I'm used to being the odd one out, so I'm always looking for synergies and cycles and things that I can draw to talk about things. But yeah.
So a couple of issues related to growth that
Sure.
I don't think covered.
Okay.
Maybe I have some comments on. One is, I think elementals of growth in the environment of Silicon Valley anyway is risk-taking.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you teach risk-taking, but I mean, you might comment on what you observe as risk-taking and your appetite for risk as being an important element of growth.
So I actually...
Second thing is having a strategy, an inherent strategy for growth scenario for developing corporate strategic relationships. The leverage you get from that is phenomenal. And I think that is something that early stage companies don't have enough sophistication for, but the bigger ones do. So as an element of growth strategy, you might touch on corporate partnering.
Okay, so thank you for mentioning those. I really appreciate that. I actually skipped a section that was on corporate culture that talked about what you just mentioned, as well as altruism. And one of the things was the corporate culture that I find in this valley is that if you're building a company, you need to have a couple of elements. So I run stats on my clients, as I mentioned. 93% of my clients have done some sort of competitive sport whether it be archery or guns or running or triathlon or tennis or whatever. I have 93% who are actually athletes of some sort. I also, if I add in the arts, I have 100% who've done something that's competitive and or where they're out in front of others presenting themselves. 1 out of every 2 of my clients is involved in the arts. And I think that's really interesting because I think with 60 companies, I'm starting to get kind of a cross-section of lots of different industries. And it's very interesting that people in this valley have that artistic side, whether they're engineers or not engineers. There's always some element to it, whether it be performance arts, dramatic arts, writing, or dancing, or something like that. So I find a lot of that kind of thing. But all of that kind of goes into the corporate culture of what you find of people here in the valley that actually are out there running businesses.
I think if you take students that are just graduating that have not had much business experience, they know nothing about corporate culture because you can't see it. You can drive by this firm here and the firm across the street can have completely different cultures, but until you dig into it, you don't know that. And I find when I mentor with students, I said, learn the culture, and is it something you can personally fit into? And if not, don't go to that company.
Yeah. I want to add one last thing. I think you have a very good point. I think that there's a huge culture shift going on right now that's really interesting. As business owners, we have a trusted network of people that we do things with, right? We have trusted advisors. And I would hazard, and I'm going to do, once again, I'm going out on a limb, so I'm just going to say what I've seen as far as a trend. Initially, it was bankers in the 70s and 80s, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s. Your banker was your trusted advisor. And then it became kind of your attorney in the 90s was your trusted advisor. But after that bust with the dot-coms, kind of the attorneys really took a dive. I mean, look at some of the major firms in the valley don't even exist anymore. And those that are climbing back, I was just out at Cooley the other day. I mean, does anyone remember what Cooley was like back in the day, right? So that went kind of through a downturn. Then we kind of went through an upswing of, it was the angel investors kind of came first before really, I mean, the VCs had always been around, but the angel investors took a lot more prominence in front of the general public than it was VCs. I think we're at a really interesting place where the next downturn is really going to redefine a new type partner with the business. And I think that's going to be your accountant. And I think that they are going to take the #1 seat. And the reason I think that is threefold, and I'm not paid to say this, these people didn't know I was going to say this. I think it's because, first of all, we're all required to use one at some point or another. We don't have enough wherewithal to understand the laws and taxation that's affecting us at this time. Second of all, it is a trusted relationship. And many firms are opening up more consulting and advising pieces to their firms, just like ASL is, and being that trusted source for you. Because if you're going to grow, and you're going to grow through top line and transactional and functional, and you're now at the point where you need to do this, you need your accountant. Because he's the one who owns the ratios. He's the one who can help you do that. So I think we're about to have an interesting twist. I think through the next downturn, accountants, I expect, will become one of the most trusted relationships that we have as business owners, which puts a huge amount of responsibility for the accountancy firm. But I think it's actually a very interesting transition. It used to be the attorney. I'm not saying that they're not, but I think that there's just a shift. It's just a little bit of a shift. And if you look at numbers, when I was a business coach, I used to do strategic alliance events where I talk about building strategic alliances for mid-sized companies and who they needed to have trusted relationships with. And the numbers have kind of shifted over the last couple of years. I'm trying to remember the organization that looks at trusted relationships between attorneys and accountants. But there's a little bit more heading towards the financial. And the accountants or the attorneys are also now doing a lot more because the tax laws are becoming more complex. So there's also much tighter a weave now between the accountant and the attorney than there was previously. So that's something I actually see happening.
You think the SOX added to that?
Huh?
You think SOX added to that?
Added? Oh, well, yeah. Yeah. In a word, yes. He asked if SOX added to that. Sarbanes-Oxley added to that. Yeah, just a little. That and ISO. Right?
Yeah. Yes, I'd like to ask you about, you mentioned the importance of networking and how, and I agree, it's very, very important. With all the business that you do and meeting people and consulting and evaluating business and looking at trends for your own business, it seems to me it takes a lot of time to do networking as well, keeping up and managing it. How much time do you spend with that aspect of what you do?
That's really good. That's a really good question. So I want to thank, I have a guest here in the audience who I've been talking to the last couple of months. Gabrielle came today. And I have been meeting with my inner circle. So I kind of shifted my focus about, so my, transparency, right? 2 years ago, my business partner died suddenly. And when he did, it changed a lot for me. It changed the business. I had to change the business because he died when he was 36. He went away for the weekend over Thanksgiving and didn't come back. And it kind of shifted how I look at relationships. And so I try and reach out, and I set a goal for myself every week of talking to 20 to 25 people who are in my network. And I just want to touch them. And I don't want anything from them, but I just want to reach out. Now, I was stimulated because something happened in my private life that made me realize that I think that I need to do that. I also come from a generation where when I first started in business, when somebody moved email addresses, you lost them. I don't have that great Rolodex. I wish I had the Rolodex that my career has had. But I'm missing 50%, maybe 60%, because it didn't really tick up until 97 and, well, really 2002, and I'd already put in 15 years. So I'm missing 15 years worth of relationships. So for me, I just spend time doing that. I don't think about it as a difficulty or as a thing I have to do. It fits very well into what I find is there's serendipity. You talk to someone for 5 minutes on a phone conversation, and I guarantee you within 3 days, somebody's going to ask you something about that. I can't tell you how many times I meet with a client, and they'll be like, oh, I said, well, what are you working on? I'm working on, I just talked with someone who's dead. Not because I had planned on it, but serendipity happens when you have a volume that is about right. And so I try and reach out to 20, 25 a week. Not all of them are conversations. Some of them are emails. Some of them I have them in cycles. So sometimes it's just a, hey, wanted to see you change jobs. Congrats. Without the notification on LinkedIn. But that kind of thing. Yeah. If anyone has any other questions, I'd be glad to take them offline. I wish you all a great day and good luck growing your businesses. And I hope to see you all here as we go through the next downturn.